A war was opened this week by a government ministry that does not fight wars. On Saturday, June 6th, China's Ministry of Transport, not its Ministry of Defense, not the People's Liberation Army, launched what it called a special maritime traffic law enforcement operation in the waters east of Taiwan. Civilian maritime safety agencies from Fujian and Guangdong, a navigation support center, a rescue bureau, the entire roster of bureaucratic, white-hulled, deliberately non-military Chinese officialdom, sailing toward an island Beijing claims but has never governed. Xinhua framed it as routine, patrols, navigation safety, administrative jurisdiction. The vessels reached the area on June 7th, and within hours, the most important shipping corridor on the planet had a new self-appointed traffic warden. Keep the word transport in mind. The choice of which ministry signed this order is the part that will still matter long after the patrol ends. This is War Numbers channel, where we don't ask who is in the right. We ask who is paying and how much. Let's count. Mao Ning, spokeswoman for China's foreign ministry, was blunt this month. Any negotiations involving maritime delimitation in waters east of Taiwan must involve China. The trigger, though, was not Taiwan at all. Sanae Takaichi, Japan's prime minister, and Ferdinand Marcos Jr. of the Philippines issued a joint statement on May 28 in Tokyo, announcing talks to delimit their maritime boundaries, exclusive economic zones, continental shelves, the unglamorous cartography of who owns which stretch of water. Beijing read the map and saw that the zone in question sits east of Taiwan, in waters it claims as its own. China did not pressure Washington. It pressured two American allies over a deal that does not mention China, by sending ships toward an island that is not party to the talks, indirect by design. The signal travels further when it bounces. Xi Jinping reorganized China's maritime forces in 2018, folding the Coast Guard into the armed police and pointing its white hulls at exactly this kind of work, coercion, that never has to call itself coercion. Beijing then built the Zhao-Tu-class cutter, the largest armed Coast Guard vessel on the planet, displacing 12,000 tons, a warship in everything but paint. Taiwan's answer, the Chiayi, the largest ship its own Coast Guard can field, displaces 4,000 tons. The gap is the entire strategy, a cutter that outweighs the defender 3-1, flying a law enforcement flag the defender cannot fire on without becoming the aggressor in the headline. The white hull is not a disguise. It is a legal instrument. A navy that crosses the median line invites a military response and a global headline. A Coast Guard inspecting traffic invites a diplomatic protest, and nothing more. Beijing has learned to operate in the exact band where Taiwan's options run out, too aggressive to ignore, too ambiguous to shoot. Every patrol that goes unanswered hardens into precedent, and precedent is how a claim quietly becomes a fact. The next instrument in that conversion is not a ship at all. It is the count of how often the pressure comes. Xi Jinping's pressure campaign runs on a measurable tempo. In 2021, the People's Liberation Army flew 972 aircraft into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone. In 2022, after Nancy Pelosi's August visit to Taipei, that figure climbed to 1,597. In 2023, it edged higher still. Then in 2024, the year Lai Ching-te took office, it exploded to 3,615, more than double the year before. The doubling is not anger, it is rehearsal. Each sortie trains air crews, maps Taiwan's radar responses, and wears down the defenders who must scramble to meet every one. The median line that once split the strait has been flown into non-existence. What was a provocation in 2021 is a Tuesday in 2024. Beijing is building muscle memory, not making a point, and the cost of answering every flight has become a permanent line item that Taipei has to fund. Lai Ching-te has answered the only way a smaller power can, by spending. Taiwan's defense budget ran 580 billion NT dollars in 2023 and climbed again the year after. In 2025, Lai's government pushed it to 647 billion NT dollars, roughly $20 billion. And for 2026, Lai set it at 949.5 billion NT dollars, about $30 billion, 3.32% of GDP, the first time the island has crossed the 3% mark since 2009. A budget of that size still buys surprisingly little on its own, because the hardware that matters is American and arrives only when Washington chooses to ship it. Lai can appropriate the money. He cannot manufacture the HIMARS launchers or the Patriot interceptors the money is meant to buy. That dependency is the seam in Taiwan's armor, and in 2026 it is the seam Beijing is pulling, because the supplier has wars of its own to fund. Lai Ching-te, speaking in May, called the American weapons the most important deterrent of regional conflict and instability. A deterrent, though, only deters while it is actually delivered. Washington broke formal diplomatic relations with Taipei in 1979 to recognize Beijing, then passed the Taiwan Relations Act the same year, a law obliging the United States to sell the island the means to defend itself while promising nothing about ever using American force to do so. For 47 years, that deliberate ambiguity was the entire design. Enough commitment to deter Beijing, enough vagueness to avoid being dragged into a war. The arrangement only holds while the commitment reads as reliable. The moment it starts to look like a chip on a negotiating table, the ambiguity stops deterring anyone and starts inviting the very pressure it was built to prevent. Donald Trump approved. In December 2025, the largest arms package in the history of the relationship. HIMARS, ATACMS, howitzers, and drones. More in a single tranche than the $8.4 billion Joe Biden sold Taiwan across his entire term. The Taiwanese legislature then passed a $24.8 billion special budget to fund an even larger deal, a $14 billion package of advanced air and missile defenses. And then it stopped. Hung Tsao, the acting Navy secretary, told the Senate in May why the $14 billion had frozen. The United States is conserving munitions for its war on Iran. The same class of interceptors Taiwan ordered is being held back to feed a different theater. Trump, fresh from his Beijing summit with Xi, had already floated the idea that arms sales to Taiwan were leverage to be traded, not a commitment to be kept. The island spent the money. The weapons did not move. An ally distracted is, mechanically, an ally absent, and Beijing chose this week precisely because Washington's hands were full. The beneficiary of the Iran war that no one lists among its combatants is the one watching from Fujian, so the question writes itself. Why would Beijing spend a decade building the world's largest coast guard to menace an island it could, on paper, overwhelm in an afternoon? The answer is not on the island. It is in the factories. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company makes more than 9 in 10 of the world's most advanced logic chips and earns roughly 7 of every $10 spent at the planet's chip foundries. Every smartphone, every NVIDIA accelerator training the world's artificial intelligence, every advanced weapons brain begins on a wafer near Hsinchu. This is the Silicon Shield, the theory that Taiwan is too economically vital to be attacked. Bloomberg Economics has now put a number on what breaking that shield would cost. Bloomberg modeled a one-year blockade, not an invasion, a blockade, the exact scenario a law enforcement operation rehearses. Taiwan's GDP falls 12.5% in the first year. China's own economy contracts 8.9%. The United States loses 3.2%. The number that should stop Beijing is its own. A contraction on that scale would erase a decade of Chinese growth, which is exactly why an outright invasion is the least likely path and a law enforcement squeeze the most likely. A blockade, dressed as administration, loads the cost onto the rest of the world while letting China throttle the pressure dial by dial, stopping short of the catastrophe that would consume its own economy too. The genius of the White Hull is that it can apply a fraction of a blockade and file it as a traffic inspection, and a fraction of a planetary wound is still the largest economic weapon on Earth. Behind the percentages are people who cannot grow what an island does not have. Taiwan imports nearly all of its energy, the coal, oil, and liquefied gas that keep its lights on and its fabs cold all arrive by ship, and it buys much of its food the same way. A blockade does not need to sink a single vessel to win. It only has to make insurers refuse to cover the route. Once premiums spike, the tankers stop coming on their own, and a society of 23 million begins rationing fuel and rice, while the chips it builds for everyone else sit boxed on a dock. The economic models call this a supply shock. On the ground, it is a darkened hospital and a silent port. Bloomberg's full crisis estimate runs to $10 trillion, about 10% of global GDP, in a single year. Set that against the war the world currently calls its largest. More than 4 years of fighting in Ukraine have cost the global economy under $250 billion. The gap is the leverage. A single Taiwanese year would dwarf 4 Ukrainian ones, and that multiplier is Beijing's real instrument, not the power to take the island, but the power to make the planet flinch at the mere threat of closing it. A choke point does not have to be seized to be decisive, it only has to be credibly closable, and the one power positioned to test that door is no longer certain it wants to keep holding it open. There is a darker mechanic inside the shield, and it cuts against Beijing. TSMC has built the machine so that capture is worthless. Its most advanced fabs depend on a constant feed of Dutch lithography tools, American software, and foreign engineers, and the company has signaled it would render the lines inoperable rather than surrender them intact. Seizing Hsinchu would deliver buildings, not capability. That is why the move is a squeeze and not a grab. Beijing cannot own the factory, but it can stand in the doorway and decide who else gets served. Possession was never the goal, control of access is. China's advantage is not one weapon but a system engineered to live below the line. The China Coast Guard fields more than 150 cutters over 1,000 tons, the largest such fleet in the world, backed by a maritime militia of fishing boats and sand dredgers that can swarm a Taiwanese outlying island by the hundreds. None of it has to fire. Here is the arithmetic of the entire standoff. A white-hulled cutter on a navigation safety patrol costs Beijing a fuel bill, while the American carrier strike group sent to watch it burns roughly $6 million a day. Beijing can sustain the pressure indefinitely. Washington cannot sustain the answer indefinitely, least of all while it is rationing interceptors for Iran. That is the uncertainty that makes the outcome truly open. Taiwan's shield depends on a supplier whose attention is finite. And here is the turn. The operation east of Taiwan was never about the waters east of Taiwan. Japan and the Philippines drew a line on a map. China answered by rehearsing, in plain sight, the one move it has spent a decade preparing, the quarantine of the planet's most important factory, carried out by clerks instead of generals, so that no one can name the morning the war began. The silicon shield was supposed to protect Taiwan by making it too valuable to attack. Beijing has inverted the logic. The same value that deters an invasion is precisely what turns a mere blockade into a global hostage situation. The shield is the target. Lai Ching-te marked his second year in office, insisting that no foreign power can decide Taiwan's future. The arithmetic disagrees. The future of the island is being decided in a Senate hearing about Iranian munitions, in a Beijing summit where weapons became negotiable, in the displacement tonnage of a Coast Guard cutter, everywhere except Taipei. Hsieh Qingqin, Taiwan's Coast Guard spokesman, said on Thursday that his service would expel without exception any vessel that arrives to assert jurisdiction in the island's waters. It is the correct answer and the smallest one. The smaller ship cannot expel the larger one. It can only shadow it and file a report. This is what coercion looks like once it has learned patience. There will be no invasion to rally against, no Pearl Harbor, no single morning the maps change color. There will be patrols, then more patrols, then a day when a Chinese traffic inspector boards a vessel bound for Kaohsiung and the world realizes the blockade already happened, one routine notice at a time. The most valuable real estate on Earth will not be taken. It will be quietly fenced, and the bill, when it finally comes due, will not be counted in territory. It will be counted in every chip the world forgot it could not make anywhere else. This is WNC. Thank you for choosing us.